So at this point in the tutorial, guys, you should have a pretty good understanding of how to use your camera and how to take a pretty decent image. But I have to say, you're only halfway there when it comes to digital photography because there's so much we can do in post-processing. In this next section, we're going to give you an introduction to Adobe Photoshop with one of the most famous and well-known retouchers in the world. Now, each year, Adobe releases a new version of Photoshop, and although they are releasing new features all the time, current Photoshop works very similarly to Photoshop 10 years ago. And so no matter what version you happen to be on at the moment, you should easily be able to follow along and get a basic understanding of how the software works. Now, if you're just getting into photography and Photoshop is either too expensive or too complicated for what you're looking for, I would highly suggest checking out Adobe Lightroom. Adobe Lightroom is fantastic for editing a large number of pictures very, very quickly. And if all you're interested in is changing the exposure and the color of each of your images, Adobe Lightroom is going to be a much better choice. But for the sake of this tutorial, I really wanted to give you guys an introduction to Photoshop, because Photoshop can do everything that Adobe Lightroom can do and so much more.
My name is Pratik Naik, owner of Solstice Retouch. I'm a high-end commercial and editorial retoucher. I'm here today teaming up with fstoppers.com to bring you an in-depth look at the introduction of Photoshop. Half of my time goes into working on a daily basis with high-end images from commercial and editorial photographers who are publishing these images around the world. But half of the time I'm actually teaching and showing other people how to use Photoshop and how to retouch images. And this is why I think this is the perfect opportunity for you to learn from me in a one-on-one experience. I remember when I started learning Photoshop back in 2000, and it was the most horrifying experience because I would open up Photoshop and realize that this program was much harder than it needed to be. So when F-Stoppers approached me to do this video, I was really excited because I could finally give back the knowledge that I have now in a condensed way. As you know, Photoshop is a really powerful program that does many things. If you're in graphic design, painting, illustration, you could do all those things through Photoshop. The goal of this video is to take someone who's never used Photoshop and go through the most basic tools to allow them to do the most essential edits possible in Photoshop. Alright guys, now that we're back at our computer, let's go and get started. Now if you're a Mac or PC, I'm going to help you go through the steps regardless of what you're using. So you don't have to be PC or Mac, but I am going to be using a Mac for this demonstration because I do think most people are using a Mac as well. So the first thing I want you to do is go ahead and open up Photoshop. And the first thing that you'll see is that we have all these palettes and windows open. Now, if you're completely new to Photoshop, which I suspect you are, we're going to go and start guiding you through the whole process. The first thing that I want you to pay attention to is the fact that you have all these little icons here on the left. Now, these icons are basically tools. And what these tools do are things like help you modify the image, such as a brush or an eraser. And we're going to get into that in a little bit more in depth. But for now, just keep that in mind. This is where all the tools are located for Photoshop that we're going to be using on a frequent basis. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see what are known as palettes. What palettes are basically modifiers towards an image. So essentially, if you're looking to lighten an image, or if you're looking to look at a histogram, or any information that you want to read from the image, you could do it right from the palettes menu. And palettes are pretty grand in terms of their definition, so we're going to get into that individually as this progresses. But for now, let's just talk about kind of the organizational factor of where the layout is in Photoshop and how to move it around. So the first thing to keep in mind is with Photoshop, it's pretty intimidating when you first open it up because you do have a lot of options to consider. Now going back to our palettes and our tools, we have a few things that we can do here right from the get-go. Now if you come back here to the tool side and you look at the top bar up here next to these arrows, it basically means that they're movable or expandable. So for example, if you go and click on these tools here, you can see this top bar and you can click on it and drag it, and it snaps right off from the left-hand column. The other benefit is if you hit the arrow key, it expands into more of a user-friendly layout. The same goes for the palettes on the right-hand side. Now if you come here, you'll see the same bar just like you do with your tools. So come to the right-hand side and snap them right off where they're sitting. And you'll see each of these little adjustments or palettes snap right off. They're essentially built like Legos, so you could snap them off or put them back together again with relative ease. Now, at the moment, you really don't need to know what each of them does, but you do need to know how each of them stack up against each other, so to speak. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to put them back together again, because with all these palettes, we can take them out or put them back as needed. The first thing that I want you to do is take one of the palettes and merge them together with another one. So for example, right now we have our layers palette. We can take that and bring it into a whole group right here. So you'll see this blue icon or blue border surrounding each of the palettes as you begin to stack them. Just by moving them into the group, you're able to easily put them right next to where you want them to be. So you could take each of the individual palettes and put them wherever you like. Alternatively, you can snap them right back out again as well. So let's go ahead and move and take out what we need to and what we don't need at the moment. So for example, let's take out layers and stack them back on the right-hand side. Now we'll take adjustments and stack them back on the right-hand side. Now every time you see a blue line or a blue window, what that means is asking you if it can join each other, just like Legos. And again, you can stack them back out and put them into their own individual groups as well. So right now we're going to have layers on the right, and we'll have adjustments as well. Now all these other windows, we can go ahead and close for a moment. Now you can do it through multiple ways. You can either come up here where the X is and click X on each of them, or you can go into this little menu option. And when you go into the menu option, you'll see it says Close Tab Group or Close. And what the difference is if you have two of them joined together and you go into the menu and hit Close Tab Group, both of them will close. But if you hit just Close, just one of them will close. So for example, let's go and hit Close Tab Group for this one, and you'll see both of them closed out immediately. Now if you go in and close one, just one of them closes out. And also if you hit X, you'll see that both of them will close out as well, just like closing a whole tab group. Similarly, at the bottom, you'll see two other palettes as well, Mini Bridge and Timeline. You can also go and close them out at the moment as well. Now, keep in mind that with Photoshop, again, there are many tools that we're going to go over. This is basically just the overview of some of the ways you can modify the overall layout. Now with the tools as well, we're going to go ahead and bring them over to the right-hand side and snap them just like you would with the other palettes. So we're going to have all the tools and palettes on the right-hand side rather than having them on both screens. And again, clicking this arrow at the top will allow you to customize it where it's either a single column or a double column. And here are other cool features with the functionality of Photoshop is with these expanded arrows, it allows you to give an icon view or the expanded view, which gives you a full outlook for each of the palettes, or basically the thumbnail view, where you can just click on them individually and it expands to what you're used to looking at. For now, we're going to keep it expanded. So with these other icons on the left-hand side, let's go and expand them. And you'll see it says History and Properties. Let's go and take the History tab, and we'll go and close that out as well. So we'll go under the menu and hit Close Tab Group. And again with the Properties, we'll go ahead and close Tab Group. Now let's say that you wanted to bring those specific palettes back again. You can go under the Windows tab, and you'll see all the palettes that we just closed out or opened. So for example, we just closed out history. We can go back and bring it back again. By clicking the history button, it brings back all the tabs or palettes that we had closed out initially. So we can bring them out and stack them just as we had liked. And secondly, we can also stack it at the bottom, should you want to place it at the bottom. Now the other great feature is these little palettes are sizable. So if you need one that has more real estate space, you can basically expand them so it gives you a larger view of each of them. Now that you kind of have an idea of how to modify this, keep in mind that even if you close out something, just go back to Window and it's all there for you. Now, if you wanted to save this, the best way to do it is coming up here to the right-hand side, you'll see a drop-down menu. Under the drop-down menu, it'll say New Workspace. This allows you to save a customizable workspace should you have any issues with other people using your computer or if you're using specific palettes for specific jobs. So if you click on New Workspace, you're able to bring up basically a prompt that says, please name the workspace that you'd like to modify towards. So you could name it. For example, we'll name this f-stoppers. And so no matter who uses your computer, you'll see that regardless of what you click, you can go back and just find f-stoppers and it opens back up again to what we had. So it basically saves what you wanted to as you're working, regardless of what you do. All right, now that we're done talking about our layout in Photoshop, we're going to go into keyboard shortcuts and things of that nature and kind of working your way on menus in Photoshop, because menus are a big part of how they work and you need to know how to modify them as well as what they do and where they're located. So after we looked at our essential layout of Photoshop, we're going to go into our keyboard shortcuts. Where you can find that is if you go into Edit and scroll down to Keyboard Shortcuts. Now the reason this is important, and it may not be so much right now, is you're going to need to be able to customize tools or menu options based on what you'd like to use most often. So for example, if you see Shortcuts 4, you can click here and go to Tools. Secondarily, you'll see application menus, which is basically your top panel here, which says Photoshop, File, Edit. And it basically tells you what you need to know should you want to know it or customize it. For example, opening up a new file is Command N. And going through the list, you'll see a whole set of options to customize and learn as you go along. But for now, let's go into Tools. So go to Shortcut 4, click on the drop-down menu, and go straight to Tools. Once you're at Tools, you'll be able to see the different tools that you can modify. Like I mentioned, we're going to be going over this individually as we go forward, but this is just a good reminder to keep in mind as we go forward. So for example, you'll see these different options, and you can easily customize them by clicking on them and changing to the letter that you'd like, and then hitting Accept. And it changes it to the exact letter on your keyboard that you'd like to change it to. The best part about Photoshop is the fact that you're able to customize anything. So should you have your own specific workflow or tools that you like to use on a regular basis, you can put that into your keyboard depending on what you like to do. So if you're a graphic designer, chances are the tools that you use are different from somebody else. Now going forward, let's talk about kind of how to manage a new document or a new canvas, so to speak, where Photoshop essentially begins. This is the essential Photoshop tutorial that you need to know in order to start working with anything, whether it's files or pictures or just anything in general, this is where it all begins. With that in mind, we're going to go and start by going to File, click New, or you could hear the Command N is your shortcut for opening a new document. This is not to open up an image, but just a blank document to allow you to start working with blank images if you're painting or things of that nature. And like I mentioned, we're using this as a tutorial to modify files and place them in different areas and so forth. So once you hit New, you'll see a couple of prompts. The first thing it asks you is, what do you want to name it? Now you could name it whatever you'd like or keep it as it is. It shouldn't matter right now. It's not going to save it just like that. But we'll name it f-stoppers just for the tutorial. Now we'll come down here, and this is where you're going to adjust the size of your document. Now to give you a good example of what this means, at the moment it's 1000 by 1000 pixels. Usually an image from a camera is about 3000 by 4000 pixels respectively. And this should give you a good analogy of how big this document is at the moment. The good thing about this is you can modify the constraints so that you make it whatever you like to be. 2000 by 1000, 2000 by 2000. And for this demonstration, we'll leave it like that. Secondly, coming down to the right-hand side, you'll see this little drop-down menu. You could change it to whatever you'd like, inches, centimeters, millimeters, and so forth. This is primarily used for, printing if you have images that you want to submit, like 5 by 7s and so forth. But for now, we'll keep it in pixels. Let's go ahead and click Open, or OK, I should say. And what this does is it brings up this blank document here. Now, you'll see a couple of things. Right now, you'll see a checkerboard. And the reason for this is it's currently transparent. So go ahead and click X. And we're going to open a new one, but change those parameters really quick. So again, go to File and New, and you'll see that our parameters have stayed the same in terms of the pixel width and height. And the reason that does that is every time you open a new document, it tends to go back to what you had set it for previously. So let's go ahead and rename it again to f-stoppers. Now at the bottom, you'll see something called background contents. What background contents is essentially, it's either going to be transparent or a particular color. Just like you saw with a checkerboard, it wasn't a pattern that generated, it was just an illustration that showed how transparent it was. Basically, it had nothing in the document. So for now, go ahead and hit the drop-down menu and click on white. And we'll go ahead and OK. So the great thing is we've opened a wide document, which is 2000 by 2000 pixels. The next thing we're going to do is go into Window and hit Application Frame. Now, what Application Frame is when you have Photoshop open, typically with Macs, you'll see that there is actually your background showing. So whenever you click on your background, Photoshop essentially disappears. But to prevent that from happening, we can enable this application frame, which enables like a net, so to speak, and allows you to get a cleaner workspace if you have a very messy desktop and you don't want anything interfering with what you're doing at the moment. So going back into Photoshop, go to Window and Application Frame. And right now you'll see the same white document, but you'll see a background. Now the other good thing is now you have this tab come up, which you previously didn't. And you'll see when you go back out of it, you can't tab it over to where it was initially. So with Application Frame, you're able to open it as a tab, just like a browser. If you're in Chrome or Firefox, you open tabs like Windows. It's very similar to that feature. The other benefit is you can go in and create a new document again. And now you'll see that you can actually put them into tabs, just like you did with your palettes. So it makes it more user-friendly to organize and go back and forth. So if you have multiple images open, this is a great way to organize your workflow as you go forward. Now, Let's go and click X out of one of these tabs. The other feature to note is if you right-click on this background, you can change it to whatever color you'd like. So if you want to change it to light gray, it allows you to do so. So if you're working on an image that's output for web and you have a white background, this is a great way to modify it so it fits the exact white balance or look that you're going for. Because as you know as photographers, based on your surrounding colors, the image changes based on how you interpret the color. So I kind of keep it either neutral gray or white, just based on my personal preference. But you could do it based on what suits your personal needs. The other aspect is, you'll see all documents will tend to have this little ruler on top from the right and the left. So what I would like you to do is you can actually modify that by going under View and Rulers. I find rulers are basically more important for graphic design, so we're going to turn that off at the moment. So with our new document open, there are a few things to keep in mind as we go forward. The first thing is we can actually move this document around in a few different ways. Right now it's centered on our screen without being able to adjust it. Now there are three different view modes as you look into a new document. By hitting F on your keypad, you'll be able to go into an expanded view, which allows you to move the document around the screen. So for example, if you hold down the spacebar on your keypad, you'll get a hand tool. What this hand tool does is now if you click on the background, you're able to modify it so you can move the document anywhere you'd like on the screen. Secondly, if you hit F again, you're able to get a completely black screen, great for presentations or working without the tools visible. So let's go ahead and hit F one more time and we get back to essentially what we're looking at on our screen. Now, the other interesting fact is if you go and open a new document again by going to Command New or going to File and New or Command N, let's go and open the same document again. And we'll go and put them into a group just like we did before. But this time what we'll do is we'll arrange it so that it's a little bit easier to work with. So say you wanted to work on two images side by side. This will give you an idea to customize it so you can work on them without having to switch back and forth between the two documents. Now under Window, you'll see Arrange. And what Arrange does, it gives you a few options to stack them side by side or however you'd like them. So for example, if you go to Arrange and Tile All Vertically, it stacks them side by side. And no matter how many windows you have open, it stacks them just the way you'd like vertically. Or you can stack them horizontally, just based on what you're doing. Or if you want a quick and easy way to do it, just go to Arrange and Tile. And no matter how many documents you have open, you're able to easily tile them across your pane. So if you're working on 15 images and you want to make sure they look pretty similar, that's pretty much the best way to do it in Photoshop. Now what we're going to do is go into basically more of our preferences to customize Photoshop in terms of colors, how fast it opens up and closes, and speeds up your overall processing. Now under Photoshop, you'll see it says Preferences. Within Preferences, you'll have a few different options to consider, such as General, Interface, and you'll see different options for you to go into. For now, hit General. And from there, we're able to basically go into all these options individually if we choose to. Now, one thing we can do right off the bat is go into our interface. This is where you can essentially change the color of Photoshop to get it back to where it was originally, or if you like the new look with it being dark gray. Under the color theme, you have 4 different options to get you to what you'd like, and it changes based on what you want. So if you wanted Photoshop to be very similar to what it was originally, you could do it by hitting the gray color scheme and it does so automatically. Next, if you go into File Handling, for example, it shows you a few different things. Now, the most interesting part about Photoshop CS6 is the ability to save even though Photoshop crashes. Now, a lot of people have had troubles with Photoshop crashing quite often, and I do as well. And the best thing I think about Photoshop CS6 is the fact that it allows you to save recovery information if it does. And that alone was upgradable, worth the upgrade for me. So if you go under File Handling and under Automatically Save Recovery Information, it gives you a prompt to save it every few minutes to an hour. Let's go ahead and hit Save to every 5 minutes and make sure that this checkbox is enabled. And this will basically save you if you're working and Photoshop crashes without you saving it. The next time you open up Photoshop, you'll load all the information that you've been working on prior to the last 5 minutes. Now, I do also encourage you to go in and research a little bit about these other features, but they're not so important to what we're doing at the moment to talk about it as detailed as possible, because Photoshop is such an elaborate program that we could spend hours doing each individual topic. But I wanted to give you a rundown of the most important features under the Preferences menu. Now, the biggest other option that is critical to us is under Performance. Now, under Performance, you'll see that Photoshop basically gives you a few examples. And what it does is it allows you to customize it so that you can change how fast and efficient it runs. For example, this tells you the available RAM that Photoshop has installed on this particular computer. If you'd like, you can change it so that it maxes out a little bit higher. For example, it gives you this ideal range at which Photoshop tells you that it recommends being at, which is pretty much a good safe range to be in if you'd like to keep it where it doesn't overheat or work itself much harder than it should. So going down here, you can adjust the slider and it allocates more RAM for your computer to speed up your processing. Now, I typically recommend setting it to about 85–90% just based on what you're working on. So say you're working on Lightroom and Photoshop collectively, you probably want to set it at a lower RAM setting than you would if you just had Photoshop open individually. So with that in mind, we'll keep it around this range just for all purposes. The next thing we're going to talk about is cache levels. Now, cache levels are basically Photoshop's way of helping you render images much more quickly as you're working. Because sometimes when you're working on very large images, it takes a while for Photoshop to redraw the image as you go and start working. This setting essentially helps you work faster because it saves that information on your computer. Secondarily, if you hover over these captions, it tells you down here in the description below, as I hover over it, what they each do, essentially. So as you can see, cache tile size, for example, tells you the amount of data Photoshop stores or processes at once. I typically leave my cache levels around 6 to 7. It goes all the way up to 8, but I find that sometimes it overworks my system, so I tend to be a little bit more modest with my setting. So we're going to leave it at around 6 at the moment. The cache tile size, again, I'll keep it at 1024, just because it is a safe estimate that most people tend to use, and is one that I stick with as well. You'll find that going lower than that will give you less of a big of a performance problem, because you're not giving Photoshop enough RAM to work with or space to work with to help you out as you're going forward. So we'll keep it at these settings for now. And we'll get into history states a little bit later as well. The next thing you want to do is come down here towards Graphic Processor and make sure that is enabled, because you want to make sure that you're using your graphics card as a processor as well. What Photoshop has done in recent versions is allowed you to use your graphics card or graphics processor to speed up the performance of Photoshop. So what we could do is go ahead and click check to using your graphics processor, and also hit this Advanced Settings button. What the Advanced Settings button does, it essentially tells you what options you have, making sure that all of them are checked before exiting your preferences. So as you can see here, it enables all three of my advanced options, which enables my speed essentially. So making sure that they're enabled, we'll hit OK. Now, here's something else that's interesting. With scratch disks, it's essentially a similar concept where if you have more memory available to use for Photoshop, it allows you to work more efficiently by reading and writing the files. So for example, if you're consistently working on big images and you want it to read much faster, it's better to have this scratch disk enabled if you have another hard drive. So for example, let's say you have a hard drive on the side and you connect it to your computer. It'll pop up with the option of a scratch disk. So you could use hard drive space more so than just RAM or your video processor alone, which will speed up your performance overall. And that's what the overall message generally is with these settings, is you want your Photoshop to work as quickly and efficiently as possible as you go forward. The reason why we're going over this area is because some of you working may have big SLR cameras like Nikons or Canons that do take up a lot of resources, especially if your computer is already slow. This is more applicable to guys like you or girls like you who need that performance boost in your computer. But for people who have a point-and-shoot camera, for example, like from iPhones, or just those little Canon ones that you store in your purse or your pocket, it should make that much of a difference. So just keep that in mind as we go forward as well. Now going under these other options, such as cursors or units and rulers, they're essentially basically vanity options. You know, how is your cursor going to look like? I think those are very based on personal preferences, and most of the people that I typically see work on Photoshop keep it at the stock level. So we're not going to be touching that necessarily right now, but if you do intend to play around with them, it gives you different options just based on what you kind of like from a visual perspective. All right, in this chapter, we're going to talk about a few different things, such as brushes, layers, and masking. Now we're finally going to get into the nitty-gritty of Photoshop and the blueprint of essentially working with images. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, we're going to come back and keep our document open. Now, if you haven't already closed your document, you have it open, but if you have closed it, make sure to go back into File, New, and you'll have your document settings already there. So let's go and hit Open, or OK, I should say. I'm going to move this around like we did previously. So we have everything on the right-hand side. I'm going to expand my palette and just stack them so that they're in one neat location for now. You don't have to keep these specific palettes open at the moment. I'm just doing it for the sake of organization. Now the other cool part is, don't forget, you can scale these, as I mentioned, vertically and horizontally. Now let's go in and, just like we did before, dock it similarly to how we did with the palettes. We took our window and brought it to the top where we have our blue border. Release it and it basically docks just like you would imagine. Now the first thing we're going to do is, we've already talked about a few things, such as hitting F to go into a view that allows you to move the canvas around, and hitting F again to go into full screen view. But we can also go back into a regular screen view and come back to the tools that we're used to. For example, let's say we bring up the hand tool again by hitting space. Now when we click on the canvas, we can't move it. But there's another way to do it if you prefer. What if you wanted to zoom into your canvas? What if you wanted to go into the image and look at the details? How would we do that? The best way to do that is by a few methods. And the thing about Photoshop that I like the most is the fact that you're able to get to where you want through a various assortment of ways. Such as the zoom key is a great example. So for example, my favorite way to zoom into an image is hitting Command or Control on a PC and hitting plus right near the delete key. And you'll see it zooms in as you go. Now the other great part is on the left-hand side at the bottom, you'll see a percentage. And also right where the document is, you'll see another percentage. That basically indicates the amount you've zoomed into an image and what level you're at. So if you're at 66%, you're almost at 100%, obviously, but you could zoom in even further. Photoshop allows you to zoom in really far, and it keeps going. It doesn't mean you've maximized your image, it just creates an artificial view of what that would look like if you'd zoomed in all the way there, for example. Now you can zoom back out by hitting either Command 0, which fits the screen, so what happens is the top of your document and the bottom of your document will stay exactly where your window is. Or you can hit Command minus. And what that does is it allows you to actually go in and out of your image rather quickly. Now, of course, there are other options and other methods of working. For example, if you hit the Z key, you'll see that there is a magnifying glass that shows up. Now, what you could do is if you click on the background while you hold your Z key down and go left to right, it zooms in and zooms out. Secondarily, you can also hit Z and Option and click. And what that does is it zooms out. Or if you just hit Z and click, it zooms in. So there are three ways of doing it, and the easiest way just depends on what you prefer, but I find those to be the most common methods of zooming in and out of your image. Now keep in mind that when you zoom into an image, you're also allowed to move it around as well. So you can combine these two functions together. So now that we're zoomed in a little bit, you can go in and hit spacebar and move the image around, even though we're not in full screen view. The only downside is, if you get to a point where your image is too small in this original view, you cannot move it around, which is why people recommend you going to the first full screen view by hitting F once. So now that we have that kind of set, let's talk a little bit about one of the major functions or tools of Photoshop, and that is the brush tool. Now the brush tool does exactly what it sounds like. It's a brush, and it basically paints for you, and it's going to come in very handy as you go forward. So let's go ahead and start by going to actually selecting the brush tool. Now going to your tool palette on the right hand side or your left hand side based on where you've placed it, you'll see the brush tool placed conveniently right here in the middle. And hovering over it will give you an idea of what it is if you're not sure of it. And this tells you directly what it is, and it says the brush tool. So we can go in and click on it, and we'll basically have activated that tool. And what that means is your cursor is now a brush tool. It's nothing else but a brush tool, and you can change your cursor to what you want based on what you're clicking. So now that we have our brush tool in hand, there are two things to remember. The paint that actually is loaded in the brush tool is illustrated by this color right down here. And what this color is, it tells you exactly what you've picked. Now, if you go in and actually click on the background, you'll see that the color starts coming out. The quickest way to change that is if you come back to where the color is located and click on that box, you'll see a pop-up show up. And this is essentially where you're able to actually go in and pick the color that you want. So you can go in and pick either a different shade of that color, a different saturation of that color, or another color altogether by picking a general color on this slider on the right. So this allows you to pick whatever color you want in the exact vibrancy or saturation that you want, or how dark or light that you want it. Now, this little box here under New indicates what color it is that you're about to pick. And the color below it shows you where you came from. Now, let's say we want a red color. We're going to go ahead and hit OK. So we have our red color selected. And this black is a secondary color or a background color. So you can also double click that and pick whatever color you want for a secondary color. This is very important if you want to change between two colors. So for example, we have red and blue loaded. So what we're going to do is if we wanted to switch between those two colors, we can actually have a shortcut right programmed into our keypad. If you hit X on your keypad, you'll see the colors switch based on which one is active. The one that is currently active is always going to be the one that's on the top of these two colors. Or if you forget the shortcut, you can just manually click on these arrows, which is sitting right next to it. So anyways, let's move forward. Now that we have a color set, we're going to be brushing on the canvas to give you an illustration of what it does. So when you click your mouse once and tap it, you'll see it makes a dot essentially. Now if you hold your mouse down and drag across the canvas, it makes a line till you let go, which then stops. So that's kind of what the brush is and what it does. We're going to talk about other functions later, but bear with me for a moment. Now there are a few key fundamental features about the brush that are very critical to know. With your brush selected, go ahead and right click on your mouse. You'll see that you have two options here. The size, which you can adjust, which is the size of the brush. So you can make your brush really large, incredibly large, or really small. Secondly, you can change the hardness of your brush. And what hardness is how soft or feathering the brush is. So for example, right now we have a 0% hardness. When we actually brush on the background, you see how soft the edges are. Now if you right click again and change the hardness, you'll see that you can actually see a difference in how hard or soft the brush is just based on that setting alone. So going back is where you can go and modify these options. Now keep in mind you can also do these as a shortcut. For example, naturally, if you hit your bracket keys on your keyboard, which is located right under delete, you'll see that the brush size changes. And you have all these different options for your shortcuts, just as we talked about. So please explore these options based on what you'd like. Now, we're going to talk about something else that relates to your brush, which is your flow and opacity. And this is going to come very handy when we start talking about masks and layers. So let's take a look at this canvas right now. And we basically have a bunch of scribble and mess on our backdrop. Let's say we actually want to undo all this mess. How can we do this? This is where the first palette comes into use, just like I talked about the palette being a modifier of Photoshop. What we're going to do is go under Window and make sure your History palette is checked. And what this palette does is it allows you to go back in time, kind of like a time machine, and go all the way to essentially where you started from. And based on where you click, it shows you all the steps along the way. Now, if you're familiar with Macs, it's kind of like Time Machine, but for Photoshop, essentially. And it gives you a flexibility that you don't have to worry about messing up as you go along. Because now you have the flexibility of changing whatever it is you want at any time that you want. Now, there's also a great shortcut for it. So if you go on your keyboard and actually, you know what? Let's go into the menu option first. Go into Edit and Step Backward. What this does is even if you don't have your history open, you can manually go in and step backwards. Now the keyboard shortcut is Option Command Z. And again, it's located under the actual panel that it's located in. If you forget, or your keyboard shortcuts. Like I mentioned, Photoshop has many ways of doing the same thing. So you can see it goes back in time, or it goes forward in time. And it says right here, step forward. Shift Command Z is what you essentially need for that option. So you have these two great options that you need to essentially memorize or get really familiar with. So you can either keep history open, manually do it, or do it through your keyboard. Now let's quickly talk about flow and opacity like I had mentioned earlier. Now what flow and opacity is, it's kind of like your speed limit and distance settings on a car. So let's say we have our brush. We have our plain old brush. We're going to increase the size of it. We're going to make sure that our hardness is set to 0. And we're going to have a decent sized brush, around 175 pixels or so. And again, you can change your brush size by right-clicking and moving the size, or you can come up top here and shift it accordingly, which is the same exact menu. Now up top, you'll see this flow and opacity setting. Go ahead and make sure it says 100. Now doing this a few ways, you can either hover over the name's flow and opacity and you'll see that there are arrows that show up. And it tells you set opacity for stroke. So you can click on the actual name and hold down your mouse and slide it left to right and you'll see it change. So go ahead and keep it at 100. And you can also use this drop-down menu to modify it. And thirdly, you can actually go and click on the percentage and enter a customized percentage. So it gives you these 3 different ways and actually a few more ways as well. So now we're going to go into flow and make sure that is set to 100. So let's go in and first do a brush stroke. We'll go in and actually do one brush stroke from left to right. And you'll see what happens is it's a clear blue line going left to right. It's completely solid. There's no transparency, it's completely visible. But if we wanted to change the value of that, let's say we wanted to make it partially transparent so we can stack different colors on top of each other. We could do that by changing the opacity. So let's say we bring down our opacity to 20%. And it's kind of like adding a tint to your car. If you add a tint to your car, you do something like 15% tint or something like that, you'll notice what that means is it makes it a little bit darker but not all the way there. So let's say we do it at 15% and we stroke. You'll see it's a lot fainter. It's not because we've changed the color, but it's just that because the brush property itself is just generally fainter now and more transparent. And we know this because if we stroke again, we'll start building on each other. And we'll build on each other till it eventually gets to 100%. And you can build on each other and add different colors to keep the progress going. Now, so what does that mean for flow? What does flow come into the mix? So let's change our opacity back to 100%. Now we'll keep our flow all the way down to, say, 5%. Now what you're going to notice is with flow, I'm going to go in and I'm going to use a solid line. But this time, I'm not going to lift my mouse up and I'm going to keep on dragging over the same line again and again. And it's going to automatically build on each other without having to lift up my mouse. So you'll see that as I go back and forth, it builds on each other without having to lift my mouse. So what flow essentially is it's similar to the speed of your car, how fast it's going. If your flow and opacity is at 100%, what that means is if opacity is your distance or your final destination or a solid color, your flow dictates how fast you're going to get to that solid color. Now, if your flow is at 100, what that means is it's going to go to the solid color immediately as you click the button. But if your flow is at 2%, it's going to take you quite a while to stack up on each other. So as we just mentioned, flow and opacity, that's how they similarly relate to each other. Flow being something that isn't constant, and it's like a speed limit and how fast you're going to get to your overall destination. It builds on each other. But if you want immediate strokes, you can keep it at 100 and 100. Play with these 2 settings to give you a better idea of what really happens as you use your brush, and it should be pretty definite and concise on what it does as you play with it going forward with this tutorial. The next thing that we're going to do is talk about layers. Now what a layer is the best way to describe this to you is very similar to looking at a transparency or a clear sheet of paper. Let's say you have a clear sheet of paper and you write on that piece of paper. You take a black ink and you draw on it. What you're going to see looking down is first and foremost, you'll see the underlying surface that transparency is sitting on top of. So let's say you have a white table. You put that transparency on that white table, you take a black Sharpie and you draw on that transparency. looking from the top down, it's going to look like you drew on that white table, but in reality, it's completely independent from that table, and you can change it, move it around, and adjust it as needed. Now that's what a layer is. You can add as many layers as you want. So if you have 3 or 4 different layers, you can add a brush stroke to one and to another, and you can move them independently around one another. So it gives you this freedom to create art or changes that don't affect the image directly. And you can also delete them, you can undo them, you can change all sorts of tools from that option. Now I have a quick picture to show you. So I'm going to go into File and Open. Now you won't have this because this is obviously just on my computer, but it's basically an illustration of what layers looks like. So for example, you'll see top down looking at this picture on the top, you'll see that we have an image with 3 lines, 3 horizontal lines, red, blue, and green. What this reflects is when you look at an image with 3 different layers, it looks like one image, and that's how it looks to Photoshop as well. Now, when you look at it from the side at an angle, you'll see what really is happening. For example, the top layer has a green line going through it. The middle layer has a blue line going through it, and the bottom line has a red line going through it. And these 3 layers can be moved around as needed, but looking from the top down, they look like one image. Hopefully that gives you a good insight of what layers is and what it kind of does. Now I'm going to go and close this by hitting the X or Command W, which will close the document. And if you worked on it, it'll ask you to save before closing. So we'll close it. We'll hit Don't Save for now. And we've come back to our original document. Now let's go and start with our first layer. To access the layer panel, what you could do is come down here to the right and basically click on this little page or sticky note. Or you can go into Layer and New and Layer. So those are 2 options that allow you to do the same thing. I prefer this because it's fast and quick and efficient. We'll go and click a new layer, and you'll see that little honeycomb grid, or I should say a square grid that we saw initially with that transparency. And that's why I initially opened it like that, just to show you what it kind of looks like when there's nothing there besides just something blank, a blank constrained document. Now, with this blank document, I have my brush selected that you should be familiar with, and a new layer which says Layer 1. You can also rename these by double-clicking or single-clicking on that individual layer first, and then double-clicking on the name. You have to be hovering over the name and not the actual background or anywhere else. You have to be on the name. And you can name this just like any other folder or file on your desktop. So you can name this whatever you want. Practice, f-stoppers, you know, go nuts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take our brush and we're going to go in and stroke anywhere on the screen or anywhere in the document. Now we're going to take this Move tool, which is this arrow on the top of the tool panel. And what this will allow us to do is move the contents of that layer around the image. Now again, it looks like one solid image, but like I mentioned, it's on a completely different plane altogether. And we know this because we can add another layer. And we can go back to our brush, and we can change the color of our brush and add another stroke. And like you've seen, we've gone over all these features before, so you should be familiar now with what I just did. Now we'll go back to our Move panel or tool, and we'll move the contents of that layer. And you notice this little line right here moves completely independently from the bottom. And the best thing about this is that if you want to move that specific layer, all you have to do is click on that layer and then move that object. You don't have to be clicking specifically on that line to move it. You can just jump to that specific layer and move that layer. So if the blue line is here, you can move that specific line as needed. That's the best part about Photoshop, is with painting or anything like that in real life, you know that you really can't undo things. You can't move things around. With Photoshop, you can do anything that you want with creativity, which is fantastic. Now let's go ahead and undo. Like I said, Option Command Z, and it undoes all those steps. Now let's say that you wanted to increase the amount of steps it goes back and forward. There's actually a limit Photoshop places for you just based on performance. But you can actually go into one setting and change all that completely. So you can undo all the way back in time up to 99 steps, for example. So we're going to go into Edit, or I should say Photoshop. And on PCs, it is under Edit, I believe, or File, or Edit Preferences. That's where it is under PCs. But on Macs, it's Photoshop Preferences, and we'll go to Performance. Or you could just click on General, and then go to Performance, because it's all under the same consolidated tab. Now, clicking on Performance, you'll see that same screen we were in earlier. Now we can go into this section here on the right, which says History States, which at the moment says 61. But you can set it all the way up, and now with CS6, and I don't remember if it is CS5, but it goes all the way up to 1,000. The interesting part about this is, even though it has 1,000 states available, it has to store all this information as you're working. So if you do notice a slowdown in your process and you don't need 1,000 steps, you can put it a lot lower, like 50, or where we had it originally at 60. So keep that in mind. A good safe estimate would probably be about 40. And as you keep getting used to Photoshop, you'll need less and less recovery steps. So we'll keep it to history at 40 for now, and we'll hit OK. So that's what a layer is, that's what a brush is, that's what brush sizes are. Now with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about layer masks, because layer masks are pretty important with functionality of files in Photoshop. Now, another cool feature before getting right there into layer masks is making sure you understand that we have an option called folders. And what folders are just organizational features that allow you to file away multiple layers. So if you have many layers, you can put them all into one folder by a quick and easy way. You can hit Command and click on the layers you want to add to the folder, and the ones that are selected, you can go in and drag and click on the folder itself. Or I should say, let go on the folder itself. And what happens is you'll see this fist right next to the highlighted folder. When you let go, it groups them all into this one categoric folder, which you can name whatever you'd like. You can also take them out of there by holding it down and pulling it back right out of the folder. And you'll see this faint gray line right above the folder, which indicates that it will come outside if you place it and let go at that moment. So you'll see it let go and it came out. There are multiple ways of doing this, but as I said, this is probably the most efficient way in terms of actually getting around Photoshop. So there's not just one method. Now, you can take them all out, a couple of them out, you can put them back in as you please, and do anything essentially that you'd like. You could even delete that folder itself. And if you delete the folder, it will end up deleting the contents within that folder as well. You can undo that as well with Command Option Z and get back to where you want. Or you can also hit the delete key, which will delete a folder or a layer as well. All right, now let's go and talk about layer masks. So what they essentially are is basically a quick way of hiding things and revealing things. And the reason why this is critical is people typically like to erase things in Photoshop, but they don't know how to get it back. They undo it and erase it. And there's a faster way of going about it. For example, let's say we have a new layer, and we'll delete this one and start a brand new one, fresh. We'll take our brush, we'll make sure our flow and opacity is set high, or what you like it to be, and we will basically stroke one quick stroke. Now, let's say we want to erase half of this line. We could do so by going to this eraser brush right here. And this eraser brush also has flow and opacity settings. You can change the size of the brush and erase just what you want to erase. But the problem is, what if you want to bring some of it back? There's no way to actually do that without undoing everything that you've done. So you're stuck with either all or nothing. And this affects you, especially if you have multiple images and you're erasing parts of the image. You're basically destroying it and you can't bring it back. But what we could do is add a mask. And what a mask is, it's exactly how it sounds. It masks things that you want to hide temporarily, but you can also take it off just like a regular mask. So here's how to do it. Let's undo this. We'll take a brush and we're going to go ahead and draw something simple. We're going to draw a circle with the X. Now let's say that we wanted to hide the X, but not the circle. How can we do this? Well, we can erase it, but like I said, you can't bring it back, or we can mask it. So here's how to access the Masks panel. Making sure your layer is active by clicking on the actual layer itself, come down here and select this Mask tool or Mask thumbnail. And it'll tell you if you hover over it and the other icons what it physically does. So for example, it says add layer mask. Now when you add this layer mask, right next to this layer, you'll see another layer and it looks like a layer. The reason why you know it's not just a regular layer is because you're going to see a paperclip or chain which indicates that, it says right here, it indicates that the layer mask is attached. And so what that means is this layer mask is ready to go and ready to modify your image. So how do we use this layer mask? Now with a layer mask, you can only have 2 different brush colors. And it uses the brush as well to keep everything relatively simple. So let's take the brush, and you'll see down here, you'll only have the white and black, and you can switch between them. If you want to reset your colors, you can hit D on your keypad and it goes from whatever color you had to white and black, for example. So with white and black, we can switch between the two with X. So with your layer mask selected, your brush selected, you should have a black paint or black color as your foreground color or your main color. Now we'll take our brush, we're going to hover over the X and we're going to start clicking. And when you click once and hold it down, you can cover the whole X right now if you want to. And what happens is it looks like it's erasing the X as you go forward. But in actuality, it's just temporarily hiding it. And the way you know that is if you look at the mask itself, you'll see all the black paint covering that same area of the image. So for example, let's go ahead and do something really quick. When you right click right here on your physical layer, you'll see a couple of options. You can say small thumbnail, large thumbnail, or medium thumbnail. When you click on large thumbnail, what it will do is it will give you a bigger demonstration or bigger view of what your layer physically looks like. So if you're working and you want to see a bigger view because your screen is too large or things of that nature, it allows you to do so. As you can physically see, the X in the middle is still there. But what you've noticed is all the black paint that we used to basically scribble out where the X was located. Now the great part about this is if you take a white brush by hitting X or using the arrow keys over here next to the paint, you can basically go in and reveal that same X that was there. And this is because we're undoing or we're erasing or taking out the black paint that we use on that mask. And you'll see what I mean in just a second when I let go. When I let go, if you come back to this mask panel, you see all this blank area. That's essentially our white paint that covered that X. So if you think about it in a way, black paint on a mask is like invisible paint. It's a cloak for your layer. And it shades it away till you're ready to reveal it again. So what is really the point of this, and why would we need this? So the point of it is essentially, if you want to reveal certain areas but not others, you can do so very gently with full control without worrying of going too far and undoing and redoing things. It makes it very easy as you go forward. It's a very temporary process. So if you've erased things and gone in further down the line and you're like, I want to come back and undo what I just erased without undoing everything, you could do so this way, just by using either white or black on a mask. You can also delete a mask by right-clicking on the mask itself and deleting layer mask. So it deletes this layer mask and you have no more mask if you don't want it there. So those are the few of the options that you could use to use a mask to your advantage and use a layer to advantage. And going forward, we're going to talk about what they do in a photo setting as well as a Photoshop setting when we're editing images. All right, in this next section, we're going to talk about something that is more useful to us now that we've understand the basic concepts of how to work around Photoshop and how layers that and all that stuff that we should be up to speed with for the amount that we should know as photographers or retouchers. We're going to talk about using smart objects and things like using working on pictures or camera raw. What are brushes that we could use to retouch images, for example, and how do we use layers in this process? So we're going to put all this together going forward in this chapter. Now, what I would like you to do is you can either follow along at the moment or open up just a general image that you'd like. But I'm going to talk about the difference between JPEG and working with a RAW file. Now, if you're a photographer, this will be more important to you than if you're just a general editor of photos or if you like to paint on photos and things of that nature. But if you like to shoot a lot and you're not too familiar with the difference, we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, before we do, let's go into camera raw for photographers who do shoot in RAW, which I think most of you do at the moment. Now, go ahead and open up a RAW file and we'll explore the possibilities of editing your picture through this process of Photoshop that it gives to us photographers. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go to File and Open, or you can double click on the background and that'll give you the same prompt, or hit Command O, which also does the same thing. And what we'll do is we're going to locate a file, and with this file, we will basically look at what we can do with this image. So let's say that we have one of these great images. We're going to go ahead and hit Open once we've located the image that we want. When we hit Open, we're going to see this nice command prompt show up. And what this command prompt is essentially the ability to modify elements of this photo that we'd like. So for example, let's say we come down here on the right-hand side. Now the way this is laid out is very similar to what you'd intuitively expect. All the adjustments we want are on this right-hand panel, where we see exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, black points, and various other features. The top represents your histogram of the image, or where all the information lies. You'll notice that this exposure basically is exactly what it says. It increases the exposure of the image. So if you've underexposed or overexposed, you can modify that right here. You'll also notice as the exposure shifts, your histogram shifts. So you're able to see how spread out the histogram or information of the image is as you're processing it. So if your highlights or if you're overexposed, you'll see all this information pushed against the right wall, which is where your highlights are. And if you come up top and click on these individual arrows, they're essentially warning dialogues. So if you enable it, it shows you that when it is red, it's basically clipped or the information is completely gone from the image and you've really overexposed it. That's a great guide to show you exactly where your highlights are and where they're not, and what's crushed and what isn't. Similarly to shadows, you can push your exposure all the way to the left and you'll see a blue shift start to come up. Now, you'll notice that this image is quite well exposed. And if you want to reset each value, all you really have to do is double click on these individual arrows that relate to the exposure shift. So if I double click this arrow right now, it'll go back to 0, which ends up starting from scratch. Now, initially what I tend to do with my processing, or what I recommend people do a lot of the time, is first and foremost go ahead and modify the exposure to what they like. Typically this is something that gets you where you want to be in terms of your exposure. But if this is something that you want to tweak even further and you feel like the image is too gray still, you can shift your black point and white point, which is essentially how dark your shadows are or how bright your highlights are, or your widest point of your image. So if you take your black slider here and shift it to the left, you'll see that the darks will get darker, because it is essentially saying that more of the image is going towards your shadows or your dark point. Now with your white point, you do the same thing, expand it as well. And you'll see that each of these areas are starting to get clipped. You'll see the highlights start to get a little bit clipped and the shadows start to get clipped in your hair and the background. And what clipped means essentially is that these shadows are being lost and there's no information left in them. The quickest way to recover that is then individually going into your shadows and highlight sliders and tweaking them to recover that lost information. So it doesn't modify your entire histogram, it just modifies the shadow region if you tamper with the shadows. Similarly, if you go into your highlights, you can modify that pretty much to the same degree. Now, that pretty much covers exposure. With other sliders like clarity and vibrance and saturation, they're very specific. So for example, clarity adds contrast to all the edges in your image. So for example, if I increase the clarity slider quite a bit, the edges will be more prominent. So if you look back at this little area in the wood, you'll see as I move the clarity up, it gets more contrasty based on those specific edges. Now with CS6, they've improved the clarity quite a bit from previous versions so that it doesn't add a lot of halos, for example, and they've really restructured and engineered this camera raw. With Adobe Photoshop CS5, you'll have a different set of settings that are similar to this, but not entirely. You'll see options like recovery, or you'll see the same exposure, you'll see fill light. And what recovery is essentially, it recovers all the blown out detail. So it's similar to looking at your highlight slider and so forth. With fill light, it adds back in light in your shadows. So keep those things and variations in mind as I go along. But in Photoshop CC or Creative Cloud and Photoshop 6, these are the features that go forward. Now with the tabs, you can also change a few things. For example, you'll notice over here you have a few different options. You'll have such options like the Target Adjustment Brush tool. And what that does is when you click on that brush, based on where you click on the image, for example, let's go ahead and click on her white jacket, and we will shift it down. You'll see all the highlights of the image start recovering itself a little bit better. So it targets that specific region you're looking at, and it modifies the luminosity based on that region that you are targeting. So you have all these extra fine tools that go above what Photoshop is built into Camera Raw. Secondly, you have options like cropping, rotating, and cleaning up that we will also further do in Photoshop rather than now, so we won't cover that specifically at the moment. The next important slider that you want to be familiar with is down here, which has all the information for your workflow. So for example, let's say you prefer shooting in sRGB, which is a very fine color space. So it's applicable for the web or things of that nature where you want your colors to be more consistent from device to device. This is where you can set it from initially. Or you can leave it in a wide color space so that you have the most options present, such as Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. And then you can modify and shrink it down later. But I always recommend staying in a space like Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB because the amount of colors that are available in your image with those two options are very vast. And then you can convert it later so it's perfect for the web. So with that in mind, we'll keep it checked to Adobe RGB at the moment. And I really implore you to look into these options later and study up on the difference between Adobe RGB, ProPhoto, and Color Space, because that's a whole other tutorial in itself, which could go on for hours. So do check that out. Similarly, you can also change the resolution, such as you can have your basic, what it was shot in, which was 4007 by 7000, or you can essentially change what size you want if you're just importing and using it for the web, for example. But I really recommend keeping all that the same for now and looking at it later. Similarly, we're going to go hit OK, and we're going to go into the other options like curves and sharpening. So essentially you have all this control from your raw file that you can do. Now here on the curve, you can basically shift your highlights, your darks, your shadows independently, so it's more user-friendly to operate. Now I still recommend you fine-tuning it as close as you can through your basic exposure settings before going in and fine-tuning your individual areas. With the curve, what this represents is on the left-hand side, you'll see the same histogram as you see on top. And you'll see the shadows go all the way to the highlights. And you'll see as I move the highlight slider, the highlight region goes up and down. When it goes down, it makes it darker. When it goes up, it makes it lighter. And that's essentially the fundamental of how these curves work. Now, let's go and turn these off for just a second. And we can also go into these other options, such as our sharpening, which you can sharpen at the moment, or individual color channels. Now what this section does, essentially you can fine-tune each color. So if you feel like your reds need to be more orange, you can see the brick wall change to orange, or it changes to more red. So it fine-tunes each individual color based on where you want to slide it around. Secondly, with saturation, it does exactly what it says. It saturates or desaturates based on what color you want more emphasis on. Luminance does the same thing for the actual brightness of the color. So if you slide those around, it increases how dark or light the color is. This is great for things like popping out the cursor from the backdrop, or if you actually want to separate them completely from something, this is a great way to do it. Or even lighten up skin or darken skin, this is another functional method of doing so. Now split toning is very similar to adding tones on images. It tells you basically what color you want in each of your regions. So if you want more yellows in your highlights, you can click your slider over to yellows and then add saturation. What that does is every highlight region has and adds more yellows to it. Or similarly, you can change your shadows as well. And you get a tone of exactly what you'd like. So let's go and put these back to default and go into the next column. Here's a great source of correction for your lens. So essentially what happens is with your lens you have a specific amount of distortion that comes with that lens. Now in this area, if you enable this lens calibration or lens profile correction, it allows you to correct for distortion based on that specific lens. Now you can adjust it and override it accordingly and change it as you wish. Or you can change color chromatic aberration. So sometimes you may see in images where on edges you'll see purple and green tints. That's what a chromatic aberration is, and that's just because of the lens and how light functions with their interaction and the sensor, for example. So with this, it allows you to fine-tune and tweak that. And you can set the amount that you want to fix or correct it, and the range of colors that it is giving you based on the amount that is showing up on edges. Similarly, you can go and override it over here as well through other options like distortion and changing it vertically and horizontally, but I really recommend leaving this stock because it can get out of hand pretty quickly. The next one, you have stuff like grain. If you want to add more noise or grain to your image, it does it from there. And vignetting, in case you want to add a vignette to your image and make the image more centralized and focused. Secondly, you have all these other options. Now, the most important thing is if you want to reset everything completely from scratch, there are a few things you could do. Now, on this drop-down menu here, and you can pretty much find it under any column that you go into, you'll see something that says Camera Raw Defaults. When you hit Camera Raw Defaults, it goes back to how the image was shot. So let's say that we like how the image was shot except for a few minor adjustments. We can go ahead and open it accordingly. So here's one thing I want you to keep in mind before opening. If you go ahead and hit Open Image, all these settings are going to open as is, and you're not going to be able to go back unless you reopen that file altogether if you want to change something. But if you hit Shift, it'll say Open Object. Now when you hold Shift and it says Open Object, go ahead and click on it. And what that'll do is it'll open up the image. Now when it opens up the image, you're going to see a little paperclip at the bottom right of the thumbnail in the Layers panel. And what that means is if you double click back on that image again, you can go back in and adjust the temperature if you'd like and anything you want, and it'll apply it right away. Now, if you feel like you're happy with these changes and you want to basically keep them as they are, you can either continue as you left off, or you can right click on the Layers panel and hit Rasterize Layer. And from there, we're going to go on and talk about retouching after that. All right, now that we've talked about Camera Raw, working with smart objects, and things of that sort, let's go and do a little bit of working in Photoshop itself with the tools we've already learned and some tools we're going to learn from scratch. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and close out this RAW file. And now you can follow along with me by opening up any RAW file that you have on your computer or just any file in general that you'd like to work on with. So I'm going to go and close this by hitting Command W like we've talked about, or just hitting the X on the actual document itself. And we'll make sure not to save this. And we're going to go ahead and open a new file, again by double clicking the background, or Command O, or File Open. So what we're going to do is essentially open the same RAW file that we had initially, but this time we're just going to go and open the image rather than a smart object, because we don't always want to do a smart object, but it's just whenever we want to have the comfort of going back and seeing if we want to make any changes in case we're not so sure for the future. But for now, we'll just go ahead and hit Open Image. And from here, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about some of the other tools that are necessary in Photoshop, such as the healing brush, the clone brush, and all the other features that we use for typical retouching or editing during the image, as well as other things to help brighten the image, help you read histograms, and all the other good stuff that we use on a daily basis. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of what we do with healing an image, or I should say removing things that are unwanted on an image. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in by hitting Command plus or Z clicking like we've talked about, and we're able to zoom into the exact area that we want. Now when you zoom in, you'll see a whole bunch of things that we can get rid of as an example. To do this, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the healing brush. Now let's go in and actually show you where the healing brush is. Now if you go into the tools option, you'll see a bunch of them we've already somewhat used, such as the brush or the eraser. Now, right above the brush, you should see a bandage. And what that bandage is your healing brush. When you click on that brush and hold down without letting go, you'll see a few options. Make sure that your general healing brush is displayed and click on that. With that healing brush active, we'll come down to our image and talk a little bit about what it does. Now, what the healing brush is a very smart tool, and what it does is it will allow you to sample somewhere where you want to pick a clean source or clean piece of skin from. Then it allows you to paste somewhere else and cover up a blemish or remove a flyaway or things of that nature. So for example, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit more, and we should see some spots we can remove. So for example, let's go ahead and make sure, again, the healing brush is selected, zoom in close, use the space bar to move the image around, and get to a comfortable area to work in. Now, once you see an area that you'd like to remove, the first thing you want to do is look for a clean piece of skin or a clean area to sample from. So it's going to be like copy and pasting. Now, to activate the healing brush, the first thing you like to do, or first thing that you need to do, is make sure you hold the Option key or the Alt key, and you should see a crosshair come up. Now, don't let go of this key till you actually click on a clean piece of skin to copy. So what we're going to do is we'll come down here and click on this clean piece of skin. And as the Alt key is pressed down and the Option key is pressed down, I'm going to then click my mouse one time. And what that did is it copied over a clean piece of skin. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and quickly heal out one of the blemishes on the skin. So to make sure that this efficiently works, make sure you first of all have a clean piece of skin copied, again by making sure you have Alt pressed down and clicking on the area that you'd like to copy. Now coming over to the area that you want to paste over and clicking and making sure that whole area is covered before you let go. And you'll see what that did was remove that specific piece of skin that you wanted to remove. Now this is where your brush size also matters, because you want to make sure that the brush size isn't too big where it removes more than necessary, but it's just enough where it removes the areas that you'd like to remove. And you could do this across the image. For example, you have other spots that you can remove by holding the Option key, sampling, and bringing it over to sample that area that you want to copy over. The good part about the healing brush is what it essentially does is it copies a great piece of skin and brings it over. But instead of just pasting it down, it pastes it, but it keeps it in consideration that the area that you are pasting it in changes in light and color. So it fixes the skin and it adjusts the light and color variations of the destination. So you get a really clean result without much effort. Now, similarly, you can keep going around the image and clicking and healing out anything that you want to remove, even little flyaways. And the great thing about this brush is it allows you to actually take the shape of anything that you like and remove whatever it is that you want. But the important thing to remember is that you do have to cover the whole blemish or the whole area of what you want to remove, and otherwise it won't do such a great job and it'll work in fragments. So keep that in mind as you're working. Even with little strands of hair that go across the face, you can easily remove things like that with your healing brush. Now the healing brush is just one tool. Now we can look at other tools with Photoshop, such as the patch tool. Now when you click or hold down the healing brush with your mouse, you'll notice that menu pop up again. And here's another tool which says the patch tool. Now what the patch tool does essentially is it allows you to actually circle a whole range of skin, should it be a big area, and move it to an area to cover it up. So for example, I'm going to go in and zoom in a little bit more. And I'm going to source this clean patch of skin over here, but this time it won't source anything. You don't have to hold Alt or anything like that. all you have to do is click your mouse down and circle a clean patch of skin, like so. When that clean patch of skin is highlighted, drag that clean patch of skin down, and you'll see what happens is the area that you are in has a different preview. What it's actually doing is based on the area that you select, it's going to copy it over. So let's go ahead and release it right here. So you saw what happened was the area that was highlighted has changed because we've selected a new source for it. This is really important because if you want to heal a big patch of skin like this, what you could do is circle it and then drag it over so it gets replaced by a nice clean patch of skin without doing as much work as a smaller healing brush, for example. Now here's a cooler option. I'm going to go and undo the last few steps we did to give us similar areas of practice. So let's say we go back into those healing brush functions and click on the spot healing brush. What the spot healing brush does is it defines automatically the area that it's going to pick from. So this is the quickest way to actually go in and modify the skin. So for example, if you don't want to do things like source clean pieces of skin and you just want it as quick and dirty essentially as possible, this is the way to go. So for example, you can come in and click without doing anything at all on the patches of skin that are bad. And what it does is it automatically defines where clean skin in and replaces it. So this is great in situations where you have a lot of spots that you want to take care of, or even background spots, or things like that that you want to get rid of in a hurry. This takes care of that pretty quick and efficiently. Now let's zoom out really quick. Now let's say that we actually want to go ahead and copy and paste something without much interference involved from Photoshop. There's another tool in Photoshop that does what a healing brush does, but very rudimentary. So it literally copies a piece of the file and pastes it somewhere else. And we call that the clone stamp tool or the clone brush. So for example, let's go in a little bit lower, and right under the actual brush tool, we'll see this clone stamp tool. If you go in and click on it once, it's going to activate the clone tool. Now you want to always make sure that you have the same settings that I do, so it works pretty much the same way. For example, opacity at 100 and flow at 100. And you could adjust these based on what you're doing. As long as you know the difference between the two, you shouldn't have a problem either way. So let's say, for example, we want to actually remove the little zipper here, this jean zipper. The quick way to do that is if we take a clone brush and actually patch it over, it will end up removing it. But the difference is with the healing brush, it's going to get a little bit confused because the area that you sample from won't match up with the area that you paste in. Since we have a lot of blues in the area, it's going to look very washed out. For example, let's say we do take a healing brush, and let's say we do sample like we did before with the skin, and we sample near where brick color is, and we start painting. You'll see that the area becomes really, really muddy because it didn't know what to account for. So it basically took the average of the area, which is the blue color, and the texture, and made it into one big mess. So with options like that, we have the clone brush, which is basically our backup. So we'll take our clone stamp tool, we'll use our hand to move the canvas, and now what we'll do is we will hold the Option key just like we're sourcing with our healing brush, click on a clean area, and then we will start painting. And you'll see what happens is it pretty much ends up covering the actual zipper without leaving it very muddy. And the best part about this is it literally copies and pastes all the information that you copied from. So you can copy anything that you want. If you want to duplicate a tree, for example, it does that. It does pretty much anything that you could think of, copying from one place to another by replicating things. And this is great for removing flyaways around backgrounds and things of that nature. So keep in mind, that's what essentially the clone brush is. Now, here's where masking is going to come into real importance. Let's say that we want to clone an area, but we're having a really hard time getting around a corner. We could use masking to really fine-tune our clone brush. So for example, let's say we want to remove this green piece of clothing. What we can do is we'll set a blank layer. So we have a blank layer, and what this is going to do is allow us to actually use a layer to clone with and modify should we need to delete it. So what we'll do now is we'll take our clone brush and we will come down here to our drop-down menu where it says sample. Currently it's set to all layers, but if you come here, it'll say current and below or current layer. Set it to current and below. And what this will do is when you sample with your clone brush on the blank layer, it'll sample the whole image, but it'll only paste on the blank layer. So for example, you see right now that my clone stamp is activated on this blank layer, but my selection is going to sample the whole image that I'm looking at. So it's sampling every layer that I have below it, including the background. So when I go and hit sample once, you'll see this little cursor that's following me is basically a preview of what it's going to look like when I paste. So I'm going to go ahead and paste, and I'm going to brush very gently over the image. And you'll see that that green area is gone. But the best part about this is that all the work we did ended up on this blank layer. So it didn't actually touch the background. Now the benefit of this is if you want to go back in time and undo things and you want to make sure you work in a way that's not damaging to your images, this is probably the best way to go about it. The other benefit is it's on its own layer and you don't have to worry about damaging your image. And secondly, we can use a mask on this. So to give you a better idea, next to each of these layers, you're going to see an eye. When you click on the eye itself, it hides or reveals the whole layer. So when the layer is inactive, it basically doesn't show up as you're working. Similarly to the background, if you hide the background, you'll see the exact area that we pasted from layer number 1. Now let's go ahead and activate the background again and look at another option that's really interesting for us, which is the opacity slider on this layer. And what the opacity slider is basically overall visibility. It allows you to look at how much of the change you want to be showing through. So for example, let's say all the changes we made to that layer is at 0%, that means none of it is showing through. But if we bring it to 50% or so, what that means is 50% of it is coming through. Now if you bring it at 100%, and you'll see the changes as you look at the file itself, is now you have 100% of it coming through. So that's what opacity means. It's very similar to how opacity works with your brush. Now that we have our layer with our clone material on there, we can easily go and mask out specific areas that we want with the similar principles we've been talking about. For example, we'll make sure that the layer is selected. We'll go down to our mask option, and we'll go back to our brush. We'll make sure our color is black because, again, black is the color that we're going to use to mask with. And we'll zoom in a little bit. And you'll notice that some of the cloned area has come up on her skin and some of the jeans. So we can easily go and use black to reveal some of it back. Now you notice some of the green has come back. And the quick way to fix that is going back to your white brush, which brings back some of the material that we cloned out, and easily just going over those principal areas that we want against the edge. This is why masking is really important, because it gives you that fine control of edging areas that you want to hide. So as you can see, we get closer and closer to what we want. So when you zoom out again, you see the whole area is masked out because if you go in and hide and unhide the area, you'll see the green strap essentially disappears. That's the emphasis of using layer masks in situations like these. Now, what you can do from here is if you want to go ahead and start saving your file, this is the perfect place to do it because you want to save often and save frequently. Because just as I mentioned, even though we have a recovery setup system in place, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be saving. It just means that it's good in emergency purposes. So let's go ahead and practice how to save files that you know how to access them again should you want to open them. So we're going to go into File, Save As, and it prompts you where you want to save your file. Now for this purpose, we'll go ahead and save it where it originally is located, which is basically the folder that I got my file from. Now up here, it tells you what you want to name it as. I typically keep my file's name the same as the image file because then you can easily access what it is that you're going for since it's the same name. Next, you can come down here where it says Format and make sure it says Photoshop. And that is basically your PSD or Photoshop document. And that's what PSD that's what it's for essentially. And when you hit save, what it does is it saves it in the Adobe proprietary format that allows you to open this file back up again with all your layers in place. Now let's say that you wanted to duplicate the background or duplicate a layer. That's also very easy to do. So let's say at the moment we go ahead and delete this whole layer. We'll hit delete and we have our background. And for whatever reason, let's say we duplicate the background. There are quick, easy ways to do that. You can go to Layer and Duplicate Layer, and it adds another copy of what you're duplicating. Secondly, you can drag your backdrop down to the new layer icon and it duplicates it for you. So those two options are what you want to keep in mind whenever you want to duplicate this. Some of the reasons why you'd like to duplicate a layer is if you want to sharpen an image and you want to change the opacity later, you can do so that way. So for example, you can go under these different filter options. Now what filters do is they modify the whole image entirely and they do it destructively, and what that means is it applies it directly to the image. So for example, we can go under Filter, Sharpen, and what that does is when we zoom in at 100% and look at some of our features, and when we hide and reveal some of the backdrop, you'll see the image sharpened up when the top copy is visible. When we look back at the original copy just as it is now, you see there's a little bit of blur or motion blur, or just because maybe she's a little bit out of focus and things of that nature. But on a top copy, since we've sharpened it, you see the image is sharpened overall. So Photoshop is also used for tools like that. And secondly, you can then also mask this one as well. So let's say you just wanted to sharpen the eyes, for example. So since we have this top copy sharpened, but you just want to apply the sharpness to the eyes, we can do so with masks. So let's go ahead and add a mask. Now, again, with a white mask, what it means is everything is still visible on the top copy. Nothing is hidden, it's all there. And remember, the color black is what hides everything. So if we go ahead and hit Command I, and what that's going to do is on the mask itself, it's going to invert it so everything turns black. Now you have to remember, if you're modifying the mask, you have to make sure your mask is being clicked on and nothing else. Your mask has to be active. If you click on the image and do something like hit Command I, it'll invert the colors of the image rather than the mask. So going back, make sure your mask is selected. Now with your white brush, you can reveal just the eyes, for example, making sure your flow is at 100% and your opacity is at 100%. And now what happens is your sharpness is applied just to the eye itself. This is great when you want to accentuate features or keep them more in focus. And as you can see, when I'm turning them on and off, the eye gets sharper. So that's kind of how you use different filters and masks together. Now there are plenty of features to explore, like blurring. There are different kinds of blurs, like lens blurs, motion blur, and things of that nature, which do very similar things to their name. You can experiment with these options by just playing around with them, but their name pretty much says what they do. Like going to noise and adding noise, it ends up adding noise to the area that you're working on. So if you have your mask selected, it'll add noise to the mask. Now, that's why I'm very topical about making sure your image is selected and not your mask if you want to affect just your image. Now, let's say we go to Filter, Noise, and Add Noise. You see that the noise is being applied to the whole image. So you can do various sorts of options, like monochromatic if you want it to be just black and white type of noise without introducing a lot of color into it. And you can change the intensity. And these sliders with the filters are very user-friendly, which allow you to customize and see as you're going. And you get that fine precision that you want coupled with the filters and the masks together. Now, let's take a look at some of the other features that Photoshop has, aside from these filters that essentially you need a copy of an image to work on. Let's say you want to add an adjustment without affecting the whole image or without duplicating the whole image. How can you really do that? And that's where adjustment layers come into play. What adjustment layers are things like adding brightness to an image without having to duplicate an image. For example, if you come down here, you'll see a pill-like button which says Create New or Adjustment Layer. If you go to this option, you'll see a few different panels inside the adjustment bar. For example, you'll see View Color Balance, View Black and White. So if you want to change your image to black and white, but you don't want to make it permanent, this is the best way to do so. Once this little filter, or temporary filter as I like to call them, is set on top, you can undo it by clicking on the eye, and it turns it off completely. The other cool part about these adjustment layers is they come with their own individual masks. So what you can do with that is if you take your brush and use your black and white, you can modify it so just the specific area is being targeted for that adjustment layer. For example, we have a black and white adjustment layer, but we have a black brush on a white mask. And what that means is, for example, when I paint black on the mask, it's not going to affect the eye. For example, you see me painting on the eye, and it ends up turning back into color. That's because the black and white adjustment layer is not affecting the eye, since we have a black mask over just that eye. And again, you can invert it and paint it back, should you want to. Now, there are other really important adjustment layers that are very critical to Photoshop and editing. So for example, let's look at one that increases brightness. Coming back to our adjustment layers, we have something called curves. With curves, what that does is it's very similar to what we did in our camera raw. We have this curve, and what we could do is set points. So once you click on this curve, you get this one point. Now, the important thing to remember about this point is you could delete it by holding the delete key, and it'll delete that point off the curve. Now, if you go back and add the point, what this point is going to do for us is we can maneuver or move that point in a way that affects the image. Now keep a close eye on the image itself and look at what happens when I push the image up and down. When I push the curve up, you'll see that the brightness goes up or the brightness goes down. So you can increase the darkness or brightness of an image. So why is this really critical? So let's think outside the box a bit. We can use this mask to brighten just certain elements of the image. So let's say we use the same example where we want to brighten just the eye or the color of the eye. What we can do is once we have a curve that goes up, we will come back to our mask, make sure it's selected, and hit Command I so it turns completely black. Now we can take the white brush and then, making sure it's small, just brush in the eye. And you'll see that the eye itself gets illuminated and not the whole picture. The other great part is if you select that specific adjustment layer again and not the mask, that curve comes back, and you can manipulate the curve with the mask there so you can see what changes are being done physically. So you could do things like lighten the under eyes, for example, lighten wrinkles, anything else, veins, or even just skin. But you want to do so very gently. And this is also where things like flow come in, where you can put a really low flow and just gently bring it in or brush it in. So that's how those things are intertwined. Again, and the other amazing feature about these adjustment layers is the fact that you can actually stack them as you go along. So if you end up actually clicking on the adjustment layer, you can see multiple different options, such as hue saturation. So you can end up saturating the whole image. And as you notice, as you add new adjustment layers, you'll see the different properties change in this properties palette. Now, you have to make sure that under window, your properties are selected and it shows up, which it will automatically even if it isn't typically. So again, clicking on hue saturation, you can manually go and increase the saturation of the image and then also impact just the eye. So those are a few options to consider. Now the great thing about this is, let's say that you want to apply both of these to just the eye together. The easy way to do that is with folders. So for example, we can hit Command and click both of these adjustment layers. We can then drag it to the folder or just click on the folder, and then we can add a mask to the whole folder. Now when we hit Command I, we can then brush in the saturation and the lightness together. So there are many options to consider with adjustments, and they're definitely worth playing around with. And again, I'm not going to go into every single adjustment layer, but they're definitely worth checking out into, especially things like brightness or contrast, vibrance, which increases the vibrance of the image similar to saturation. But the difference being with the vibrance, what vibrance does is if you have a color that's already oversaturated, vibrance basically lifts the colors that are undersaturated first to meet at a similar level. So it gives you a more even tone area, at least from my understanding and a physical viewing of how they work. With saturation, it increases the saturation across the board. So if your reds are kind of saturated and your blues aren't, they will still go up equally, where the reds will be very saturated, but the blues will only be just, barely saturated a little bit more. So those things are important to consider. The black and white filter. We have things like photo filter. If you want to add tints to your image, you could do so that way. But you want to make sure that if you do make a folder, that you keep it outside the folder and not within, especially if you're masking and things of that nature, and you want to add more adjustment layers going forward. So now that we've set up adjustment layers and kind of gone over them and how they interact with masks and folders and things of that nature, let's go and talk a little bit more about the other palettes like we mentioned earlier. Because palettes are also very powerful in helping you define your image and looking at some of the tools that go into working with Photoshop. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and delete everything we've done so far. So we'll go ahead and delete on our adjustment layer on top and on our group. Now let's go in and check out the ones we have open right now. So for example, info. What info does is anytime you have your cursor or your brush or just anything in general looking over a particular part of an image, it tells you the reading at which the color is. So for example, it tells you how dark or light a color is. And if you look at the readings at the RGB scale, you'll notice, for example, on this color where my arrow is, it says R is around, let's say, put it here on 200 across the board. And what this means is the reds are a little bit higher in number, and the green and blue are about the same. So it's essentially reading like the skin's a little warm, but it's also bright. And 255 is essentially the end point. So it's showing you how far the color is towards the ends. And so you have these little palettes like that. Now properties, for example, is basically when you have an adjustment layer, it gives you all the options that the adjustment layer provides. So you can modify the adjustment layer, tweak them, just like I do with our curves or color and things of that sort. History, like we already previously discussed, just goes back in time should you want a visual layout of what you've been doing. Now, with other things like adjustments, this adjustment palette is basically the same thing that we had down here, except it's on its own little palette, so it makes it a little bit more convenient should you want it opened. Now the other cool thing is this color palette. And again, remember they're all located under Window, and they're each distinctive locations. Now what this color palette does is, let's say you've selected this blue color, and you want to go ahead and modify it so that it is a little bit more pink, for example, adds a little bit more reds. You can see when you add a little bit more reds or shift it, it changes to this other color. Or when you modify the green area, it shifts to the colors that are provided. So you can pick a color that you want and tamper with it just to get the precise color that you're looking for. Now, obviously, each of these little areas are not appropriate for everything we're doing. So for example, let's go ahead and close out a few. Let's close out this color tab here, and we'll go into Window and look at some other ones, like Brush, Window Brush. What Brush does essentially is, if you have your brush selected, which is B on your keyboard by default, you'll get some options, like the ones that are pretty standard are Shape Dynamics. What this is, if you use a pen tool, which I usually do, like a Wacom Intuos or a Bamboo, for example, you have pen pressure that is usually provided during retouching. Now, when I'm doing this demonstration, I'm primarily using a mouse, so it makes it comfortable for you as a viewer to see what it is that I'm doing. But when you use a pen tablet, you can also go in and change pressure sensitivity. So based on how hard or light you press, the more opacity comes out of your brush, for example. So under Shape Dynamics, you can control physically what the pen pressure is going to be and how much is going to be applied, for example, or you could turn that off. But it shouldn't matter either way if you're using a mouse at the moment. Now, that's what Brush does. Brush presets are things like, if you like a particular brush size and a different feel for the brush, you can save that under its own little preset. So once you have your brush selected, like a particular softness and a size, you can hit Save Brush and it will be categorized under this column here. You can also access this by right-clicking on the image, and you'll get that same column that shows up as well. So with that in mind, we'll close these two tabs. And let's see if we have any other really important ones we want to go over. Now, histogram is basically exactly what it says. It shows your histogram for the image. It shows you where your highlights are, where your shadows are. And this is also very critical, because let's say you're working on a computer or a screen that's not calibrated, or it's not up to par with what you think you should be seeing. This gives you a great insight on, is my image actually too bright? Are things being clipped? And things of that nature. Secondly, we have other ones as well that are not particularly important to us, such as paragraph or paragraph styles, which is for text purposes. So we'll skip all that for the moment and pretty much keep it just as is. And again, I implore you to research any ones that you'd be interested about going into further detail, if it's not specifically photography related, or even if it is, it makes it great for your overall knowledge set. And it allows you to explore different tools as well. What we're going to do first is talk a little bit about something relating to layers. And this is critical because this goes over things like adjusting colors or light in a very different way, which is similar to adjustment layers. And let me show you that really quickly before we move on to our last few steps. So let's say we add a new layer and we want to actually change the color of the lipstick, for example. A really quick way to do that is, let's say we have a color or a brush selected, and we sample a color of the skin. And it's the same way to do that is if you hold Option, you'll get this little eyedropper tool. And what this eyedropper tool does is it samples the exact color of the skin, so you can pick up different readings wherever you like. Now the cool thing about this eyedropper tool, if you keep selecting, you'll notice this little half semicircle ring in the middle. What that means is that the bottom half of the ring is your last selection, and this top half of the ring is your current selection. So if I select this shadow, you see the top selection is really dark. The bottom selection is really bright. That basically allows you to compare where you came from to what you're actually pasting or copying. So let's go in and copy, say, the cheek color here, or even a lighter color up here. Now we're going to go ahead and paint on the lip. Now you notice right now that we're just painting on the lip and that looks pretty terrible. But what we can actually do is under this little panel here is what we call blending modes. What a blending mode is essentially what the layer does differently if you wanted to change properties. For example, if you come down here and select color, it changes the actual color of the lip. And the way that it works is it takes the underlying layer and reads the information that's there. So it reads how hot it is, how saturated it is, and then the color that you pasted on top on that blank layer, it looks at it and says, all right, this is the level of saturation that it's at, this is the color it's at, this is how bright it is. Let's kind of match that up with the texture of the skin below it, and it matches it up exactly to what you picked. So it even takes into account of the saturation of the color that you picked as well. And there are a few other options like soft light and darken or multiply, and they do various sorts of things. We have a great article on f-stoppers about blending modes, and blending modes is essentially a whole different topic on its own. It goes over hours and hours of information and what they do differently. I don't use it specifically that much for my workflow personally, but it is great to read about. So if you go to fstoppers.com and search for blending modes, you'll find a fantastic article that goes over every one of these in very high detail. So check that out if you have time and you want to learn more about how you can use that in your workflow as well. Let's go on to things like cropping, saving, sharpening. And that'll be essentially what we cover for the rest of this tutorial. Now, with cropping, the interesting thing about CS6, I don't recall this being in CS5, is that there's an option up top here which says delete cropped pixels. What this means is that if you take this crop tool and you click on one point and drag it across her face, you notice that it shows you a darkened gray area around her face. What this means is if you hit enter, basically all your pixels around the face is basically gone. And you're cropping in essentially what part of the image that you want. Why would you do this? The point of this is to crop for print. So say if your client wants a 5:7 print, or if you're doing a web banner which is only 1080 pixels in width and 720 in height. It gives you options to do different things with the same image. But I do recommend that if you're cropping something and you want to save this, don't overwrite it on the same file. So don't just go back and say File, Save, and what that'll do is it will save over that PSD that you originally saved. What you do want to do is go to File, Save As, and rename this to something else. And that will basically allow you to keep two copies. One for the PSD that you're working on and one for another PSD, for example. So the great thing, as I mentioned, about Photoshop CS6 is with this delete crop pixels option, if you uncheck that and then go and crop in, what it will do is it will allow you to undo it. So for example, let's say you crop something and you say, you know what, I think I want to recrop that just a little bit differently. You don't have to undo it. All you do is basically make sure your crop tool is selected, and you can either recrop it by dragging a new slider or select the edge and move it out and then hit enter. So it saves all the information there, and that's very important for people who are cropping for web and things of that sort. Now, let's talk about Liquify, because Liquify is a tool that is very easy to mess up. I think it is the most misused tool by a long stretch. So for example, let's go into Filter, Liquify, which is where it is located. And again, it is a filter, so it's going to apply it to the whole image generally, unless you have something like a smart object and things of that nature. But with Liquify, what you can do is once you hit Liquify, you'll notice that you get another screen and you get another set of options. But we're not going to worry about all those options necessarily right now. We'll talk about them briefly and the things that you really need to know. So we'll go ahead and zoom in. And you'll notice that everything looks pretty much the same. It's the same image that you're working on. But the important thing to remember is that you want to make sure that your brush pressure is very low, because what happens is with your brush size, that can change just like you're used to. Now, let's say you have a brush size about that, and you start grabbing the pixels and pushing it in. And the way to do that is you can start by clicking anywhere and then moving your cursor left or right. And you'll notice you can move around the image pretty intensely, making sure that this push tool over here is set. So what you want to do is, with this brush pressure, bring it down pretty conservatively, say 15, and then try and move it. You can see it does it very gently. And the reason why this is really important is it nudges pixels in the right direction rather than just ultimately destroys them, making it very hard to control otherwise. So with your pressure, you can do things, modify things. For example, you can take the hair and make it give it much more volume, increasing the brush size considerably, and then just pushing your hair outwards. And what that does is increases volume, for example. And you can even push the sides in if you'd like, or push the jacket out if you'd like. And just basic things like that. It gives you a good idea of what you can and can't do with it. So if you hit OK, it accepts the changes and applies it to your image. If you hit cancel, it goes out of it. Let's hit cancel. One other thing to remember about Liquify. If you have a blank layer or an adjustment layer, for example, let's do an adjustment layer. We'll put a curve up there. If you try and go into Liquify, it will want to liquefy the mask because it has the mask selected. Let's say that we do a curve. And let's say we have a whole bunch of other layers and we want to liquefy what we're seeing at the moment rather than just the base layer. And the reason why we want to do this is creating a copy of it allows you to actually work non-destructively. So if you want to go back, you could just delete the top layer. So here's how we do it. When you go under Layer, you'll see an option called Merge Visible. Before clicking on Merge Visible, make sure your Option key is held down. And then click Merge Visible. What will happen is you'll see this copy on top. Now if you look carefully at these thumbnails, you'll notice that the top thumbnail is bright and saturated, and you'll notice the bottom isn't. And the reason why this happens is what we've essentially done is we've created a visible stamp of what we're looking at from the top down, copied that, and placed all that information on the top. So for example, let's say we hid that layer, and we have just our two adjustment layers visible. We have the vibrant saturation, and we have the curves. So when we add these two together, and we want to make a copy of that and put it on top, that's the way to do it. So no matter how many adjustment layers you have, you can do that and then liquefy that specific copy. This will allow you to delete that copy as well as undo it if you please to without affecting the bottom image. So with that in mind, we'll go and delete that, and we'll keep our base exposure as our kind of example going forward with our other features as we close out this tutorial. As we mentioned, similarly to liquify, if you're also interested in sharpening things, that's the other way to make sure you can do that non-destructively. So if you have all those adjustment layers, for example, and you're modifying them, what you can do is make sure that once you have your final PSD ready to go, you can easily go in, go to Layer, the Merge Visible option, but make sure you have your Alt key pressed and hit Merge Visible. And then once you have your image on top, then you can go in and sharpen as much as you like, either by going to Sharpen or other options like Unsharp Mask, which gives you more in-depth control for the amount of sharpness that you want, with this little box giving you a preview as you keep updating it, and then adding a mask just based on if you want to apply to the whole image or the individual area of the image, such as the eyes or the lips or the hair, for example, like we talked about earlier. So we'll go and cancel this for now. Let's say that we like this image and we want to save it as a JPEG for the web, or if you want to upload it to Facebook, for example, or even any other social network for Flickr or Tumblr or what have you. So first thing first, go ahead and make sure that this document on the top says .psd, which is the most active PSD that we had initially. Go into File and Save. You have to remember though that if you're shooting on a card, or if you're shooting from your card and you put it into your computer, you don't want to save over that same file that you shot on. You want to make sure that just like we did initially, you save as, File, Save As, and save it as a PSD file first so that it doesn't overwrite the same image that you shot on, and that stays individual. So again, make sure that you have your same PSD set. So you go Save As and make sure that you have a PSD set. If you haven't, this is the time to do it. Once you've already hit Save As and you have your PSD set, you can go to File and then Save like we just did. And that will save over and rewrite that PSD. So the first thing is Save As to write a PSD file so that you have all your layers. And when you make continual changes to your layers, then you can hit File Save. The only time you don't want to use File Save is if you've opened up the original JPEG, for example, and then hit File Save, because it will overwrite that JPEG. So keep that in mind as you're going forward. Now let's say you want to output this for the web. We can go directly into File and Save for the web. But as you see, the image size exceeds the Save for the web designation because our image size is still in full resolution. So what we can do is go ahead and hit No, because even though we can go and continue, we don't want to save a full res image to the web, because it will allow people to download your file, for example, and it is a really big file. As you can see, our view at the moment, looking at the top left, is only 25%. So if you zoom in closer, you can see that this is 100% of your image. Now again, hitting Command O or 0 to bring back and fitting it into the screen, or Command plus and minus, you can zoom in and out. So let's go in and go to Image, Image Size. Now we can change our dimensions like we've noticed. So we can say, for example, that for the height of the image, we can put it to somewhere like 960 pixels, for example, if you prefer a small resolution. And what that does is if you hit Enter, it will also automatically change the width of your image because they're linked together. So we'll hit OK. And what that does is recalculates that image so that this is 100% view and this is the view that will be displayed on the web, as an example. Now there's also another option which says canvas size. What canvas size is essentially your background. So if you wanted to extend your background and add framing, for example, you can change it. And here's a good way to do that. Now, next to the width and height, you remember we had inches, pixels, we even have percent. So if we change this to say 120% and we extended the background, which is ultimately what that means, we can also change the color of the background by clicking on the color and changing to what we like. Now you'll see that we've added a black border to the image as well by extending the background. So the canvas size is not your image size particularly, even though they do seem kind of related. Because if you've increased your image size by 120%, you're just making the whole image larger rather than adding a black border or extending the canvas of the background. So let's undo that and go back to the fact that we've already saved this, resized this for web purposes. Now I use 960 pixels as an example, but you could use anything that you would like. For example, if your website says that keep it at 800 pixel width, that's where to do it, under image, image size, and you can make sure that the width is under that much or just that much. So we can go ahead and hit File, Save for the web, and then now it allows you to give you a few options. The first thing to remember is over here you can come down on this menu and make sure that the appropriate file type, which usually is JPEG, is selected. When you have JPEG selected, you can change the quality of your image. Now the reason why this slider is here is because even though a lot of the times for your website you're saving it at 100%, what 100% means is if you look down here, the left-hand column, you'll see this little indicator which says 490K. And that's essentially your size. And let's say you want to send an email to somebody and you want to give them a quick screenshot where quality doesn't matter and you just want to show it to them. If you reduce your quality to say 59% or even 0%, you can see how the quality degrades based on the preview that it generates. So if you save it to 50%, for example, and you see that the quality is acceptable for the intent that you're going for, you could see how the file size shrunk considerably. It's now at 98K. And that's a big difference. So keep these two settings in mind based on what you're trying to do. You can even change the image size as well in this panel, but I like to do it in the image size dialog box. Now, let's say you're ready to output and you're happy with this. You can then go to File, you can then go and hit just Save. And what Save does is it prompts you on where to save this. I typically recommend saving in the same folder that you had saved your PSD, but making sure that you rename it so you know what it is. So for example, that's the file name that it brought up automatically. And we can omit that by adding web at the end before the .jpeg to show for your recommendation that this is the web, this is a web copy. Or you can even name it web 960 to illustrate that this is how big the file is for this particular version. So, and then when you hit save, you'll have all the images where they are, how they are, and so forth. But make sure you do hit save and it will save that for you. It won't overwrite your PSD, so don't worry about that, and that PSD is saved separately. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what we've done in Photoshop to now, all the way from the beginning using layers and getting it customized to palettes all the way to sharpening in our final steps. Now you should get a firm grasp of using Photoshop for your advantage. But before we go, let's take a look at 5 quick examples, or at least a few of them, to give you an idea of what can be done from scratch going forward. Alright, so now we're going to talk about 5 quick examples to give you an overall taste of what you can do with your photographs in Photoshop now that we've covered a lot of the basics, to get your mind around the tools that we just finished going over. Now, we're going to be essentially focusing on both the raw conversion if you're shooting in raw, and also using adjustment layers to modify some of the colors of your image and what you can do with cloning and layers and masks like we've talked about. So let's go ahead and get started with the first example here on the computer. So I'm going to go and take my image and open it in Photoshop. Now a cool tip if you're not familiar with Photoshop, from where your file is located, you can either double click on the actual image, or you can also drag it right into Photoshop and it loads up automatically. Now with this file, one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of clone out a few things. This is such a beautiful image, everything is well shot, the lighting is great, and we can tweak a few things. Like let's say we want to tweak the exposure just a bit, or we want to darken the blacks of the hair and the shadows. We could do that and make sure that our exposure is perfect. So let's say we do a little tweaks here and there, but we want to start cloning out some of the grass, for example. Now we can do this very, very easily. We're going to go and open the image. And even though we could open it as a smart object like we talked about before, we're just going to go and open an image since we're not doing anything drastic or we know what we're happy with. So let's go and zoom in. And there's one quick thing I want to do. You see this area here with this green patch growing from the sidewalk. To me, it's a little bit distracting. Or even some of the chipped gravel here. Let's say you want to remove that temporarily. And maybe you don't. Maybe it's just something that you want to keep. But this is still good practice if you're visually thinking about other things to remove in the future. What we could do right now is set a blank layer. So we come down to our new layer panel, click new layer. We'll go in, make sure that our clone brush is selected. And don't worry about all these other panels at the moment. You can keep them on, close them. It doesn't necessarily matter. They just carried over from our tutorial. So we'll keep our layer selected. We'll come down here with our clone brush, making sure that our brush is big enough to clone from. So say about 100 pixels. We will sample close to the gravel here. We'll click, come over where the green shrub is, and now you see a preview generating. What we'll do is now once we click, it'll paste a clean set of gravel to cover basically kind of what we want to cover up. So we can resample again if you'd like from any other source and basically patch up areas that you want to cover. Now what happens is whenever you click your layer, or visible and invisible, you'll notice that the layer gets covered up. Now the good thing is that because it's in its own individual layer, should you not like the change, you can either just delete it, or you can delete it by dragging it down to your trash can. And the best thing about working in Photoshop is the fact that you can save this as a PSD file, so that when you send it to your client and they're not happy with it, all you have to do is open up that PSD, delete it, and then send them another JPEG. So again, File, Save As, going to the location you want to save, making sure your format says Photoshop, and hit Save. And then when you want to export it, go into Image, Image Size, change it to the dimensions that you want to go, or you want to send it to, and then going File, Save for the web. And again, even though you could do it here, I much prefer doing it through image size just for practice. But in the future, if you'd want to come here and change it, it allows you to do so. Make sure you also have this convert to sRGB function set, which allows you to make sure that your colors will stay consistent through the web, no matter if your client sees them or in Photoshop as well, since this is a web preview. And then you can go in and make sure you're set to JPEG and the quality that you want, and then hit Save. And that'll allow you to keep your PSD file and the preview just for your clients. So that's one quick example of something that we do in Photoshop. Let's go on to another one. All right, for our next example, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to physically be removing in other different ways and what else we could do with our raw file and through Photoshop's adjustment layers. Now over here, let's do a quick adjustment just to import the image. We'll change our temperature a bit. We'll add some vibrance, and we'll go and import this really quickly. Now let's say, for example, we zoom in and we see this beautiful shot, but oh, she's chewing gum. There's a quick way to actually just remove this, very similar to the shrub. Now I'm going to show you this clone technique because, again, it's very useful for cloning things out. You also have to keep in mind this clone brush can remove anything you want, whether it be a person or a tree or wrinkles or hair. This is up to your imagination. What I'm showing you is the tools to give you the intention to do whatever you like with Photoshop. Now zooming in, it's the same process where you have to select the clone, the source, and then paste over the area that you're removing. Now with such a small area, you want to make sure your brush is smaller and not such a wide brush like a general area. And we're going to do it in 2 steps. We'll take our clone brush and we'll start cloning, just generally making sure it's not covering the teeth. Then we'll clone from the other end, making sure that the other area is being covered really nicely. And what happens is the gum starts going away. And you have to keep on resampling, making sure that you use an area that is very nice and very even. And then what happens is you'll notice that the area is being covered perfectly, just by being careful. Now let's say we end up zooming out. You notice that when we send images in print or web, they're approximately this size, so you don't tend to see all the minute details. But when you turn your layers on and off, you see that the gum is removed. Now what's something else we can do with this? Let's say that we want to brighten or lighten up the trees, or let's say we want to actually make the couple pop even more by making the background darker. We could do this very easily. Let's say we go to our adjustment layer and use a curve. To make things darker, we pull our curve down, and you'll see everything got dark. Now let's say we want our couple to stand out just like they originally were. We can go back on our mask, take our brush, making sure that we use a black brush so that the changes don't get applied to the whole image. And then what we're going to do is paint the couple so that their original luminosity comes through. And what happens is this allows you to separate people from the background, for example. If you use a lighter flow, you can bring things in much more gently. And now when you turn on and off the layer, you see that the background got darker and made the couple stand out just a little bit more. Now, we didn't do a great job of masking, but that's just a little bit of extra effort in making sure that your masking is really nicely done and very gentle. So keep that in mind. With adjustment layers and masks, you could do so much more. So now I'm going to open up a few more pictures and show you a quick couple of things that we could do before we wrap up this tutorial. Let's go and get started and check out a couple more images. Now, here's a good example. Let's say we take a look at this typical bridal shot. We're going to go and click open. And let's go in and use Smart Objects as our tutorial for this one. So let's go and hit Shift and open object. And what we're going to do is come back into Camera Raw and adjust what we want after the fact. So this is good if you're trying to make an exposure adjustment and want to come back and modify things. Now we'll go and double click on the Smart Object and then just start adjusting sliders as you see fit. And so for example, now you can go in and change any white balance that you want on the area that you want it and increase the vibrance and saturation, for example. And we'll go ahead and click OK. Now let's say that we want to go and make other adjustments, such as increasing the saturation of the flowers using adjustment layers. We'll go and add an adjustment layer for hue saturation, and we will bump up the saturation of the whole image. But we won't be applying to the whole image because of the masks feature. Now come down to the masks and go ahead Command I. So we invert it and that everything that we've just done is hidden. Now we take our brush tool, making sure that it's white, and we're going to come and paint just the flowers so they stand out on its own. Now make sure your flow and opacity is where it's at. If we keep a low flow, what's going to happen is as we zoom in and start painting, you're going to notice that the saturation comes up as I'm painting, but just very slowly. And it gives you a greater control of exactly where you want to paint it in and how much saturation you want applied. So the great thing about using smart objects and coming back into it and making sure that you're happy with the results and then changing after the fact is a great tutorial, along with using flow and using masks with hue saturation to get a fine-tuned result based on the area that you're working in. So let's go and exit this one and go to one other one. So we'll double click on our backdrop and we'll go in and make sure that we have our exact file selected. Here's a great one with a bride that's standing in front of a really nice turquoise building. Let's say we open this image pretending that it was shot in JPEG, for example. Because from now we can't go back into Camera Raw since we didn't open this as a smart object. So let's pretend this was shot as is, and now we're going to go in and modify the colors of the backdrop to make it really stand out, because it is a beautiful color. So what we're going to do is, there's another adjustment layer in Photoshop called Selective Color, and also Hue Saturation that does the same thing in this regard. We can go in and go to Selective Color, and what this will allow us to do is, once we have this loaded, we'll have this Adjustment Properties layer here, just like we have been with our curves, and we'll see these different color drop-down menus. What it's basically saying is it's asking you to pick a color that you're going to be modifying. So for example, we'll pick cyans, because that's essentially the color that we're going to be modifying for this tutorial. We'll pick cyan, and then now what we can do is we can enrich it or lighten it. For example, we can go into our black panel, and what this does is it shifts over how light or dark that specific color is going to be. So it deepens that color of the background. Or you can add colors or take away colors from it to change it. So we can add yellow, and we can remove yellow, or we can add magenta and take away magenta, giving us a different feel altogether. Secondly, you can also do the same thing through your Hue Saturation slider. So if you go into Hue Saturation, you have the same drop-down menu under Master. So you have reds, yellows, greens, and cyans. And if you hit cyan, you can change the saturation of that color as well. So you can combine the two to add different look and feel based on what you'd like. So this is a great example of showing you how you can combine adjustment layers to create different effects just based on what look you're going for. Similarly, you can also target the model's skin with a lipstick just by going to the red drop-down menu and sampling those colors. Finally, we'll take a look at one more image and wrap this up with a final example, just to give you a quick look. And this time we'll talk a little bit about what we can do with the raw file. Just as a recap. Now here's a really great image that is taken outdoors on the water with a lot of clouds, and we want to make it look really intense. The quickest way to do that is first being able to really pull the histogram so we can get a rich, deep shadow area, a lot of white, and adding a lot of contrast. You can push the contrast region, you can change the clarity, so giving a lot more contrast between the edges of the clouds, for example. And what that tends to do is it enriches the image and adds a lot more intensity to it. And then you can further change the temperature to increase the effect that you want essentially from it. And then going into the split toning, for example, and adding a mood by adding blues in the shadows and making sure you increase the saturation and adding some yellows in the highlights. And then what you get is a really impactful image that says a lot for this particular look. And now if we go back and reset the defaults, you'll see the huge change that we just did just with these quick settings alone. Now one last thing I want to show you is when you open up an image or change this under image and image size, you'll see something called resolution. For the web, this number doesn't matter even if you have 72, 300, 3000, but what matters is your pixel density. So for example, if it's 4000 pixels width, if you're putting it on a screen, and if you have 72 pixels per inch or 300 pixels per inch, it won't affect the way your images look on screen. That's particularly for things like printing and instructions like that, which you will get from your printer if you do submit it somewhere to give the best print possible. So keep that in mind when you resize the images, not to be so concerned with your particular resolution. So that wraps up our quick 5 image demonstration of things that you can do with Photoshop and just general changes.
Now that you have a basic understanding of how Photoshop works, let's actually take that knowledge and put it into practice. I know I, for one, can't really learn anything until I do it myself. So we've compiled a few images that we took earlier in this tutorial, and we're going to take them into Photoshop. You're welcome to follow along with the very same files if you like, and we're going to take a standard picture right out of the camera and make something special with it.